The biting wind whipped Alara's thin shawl around her shoulders, offering no protection against the late autumn chill that seeped into her bones. The air in the makeshift market square of Oakhaven was thick with the scent of damp earth, nervous livestock, and the underlying stench of desperation. She stood on a raised wooden platform, splintered and rough beneath her worn boots, her sisters lined up beside her like a row of withered saplings. From oldest to youngest, Beatrice, solemn and pale. Clara, gripping a frayed doll. Dorothea, eyes wide with silent terror. Eleanor, face hidden against Beatrice's side. Faye, barely more than a child, whimpering softly. And Alara herself, the eldest at 17, trying desperately to project a composure she did not feel. Below them, a sparse crowd shifted, their faces indistinct shadows in the weak afternoon light. The auctioneer's voice, harsh and booming, cut through the low murmur, enumerating their supposed attributes with cold, practiced indifference. Beside the auctioneer stood their father, Elias Thorne, a man whose face was a mask of calculated indifference, his eyes fixed on the potential coin, never meeting the gaze of his daughters. He had gambled away their mother's small inheritance, their meager home, their future, and now he was selling them. The humiliation was a physical weight, pressing down on Alara's chest, stealing her breath. She felt exposed, vulnerable, stripped bare not just of dignity, but of personhood. They were items on a block, their value measured in their youth, their potential for labor or marriage. The stares of the men below felt like physical blows. A man in a dark coat laughed coarsely at something the auctioneer said about Dorothea's youth. A woman in the crowd tooted loudly, her judgment a sharp, unwelcome sound. Alara's gaze swept over the faces, searching for, she didn't know what, a flicker of kindness? A sign of salvation? She saw only avarice, pity, or cold curiosity. Then, her eyes landed on a figure standing slightly apart from the main cluster of potential buyers, near the edge of the square, partially obscured by a wagon. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, clad in simple, dusty range clothes, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, concealing much of his face, a long duster coat, worn leather chaps. He held himself still, a study in quiet observation, his presence somehow commanding despite his lack of ostentation. He wasn't like the others, no eager glint in his eye, no leering smile. He simply watched, his posture conveying a profound weariness, or perhaps just patience. The bidding began, a low rumble at first, then rising as numbers were called out. Alara's heart pounded against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her sisters huddled closer, their small bodies trembling. Beatrice whispered a prayer under her breath. The air grew tighter, the focus of the crowd narrowing onto the platform. Elias Thorne leaned forward, a predatory glint in his eye. The auctioneer's voice rose in pitch, urging the bidders higher. Just as the first sister, Beatrice, was about to be struck down to a man with a cruel mouth and grasping hands, a voice, deep and resonant, cut through the din, firm and clear. It came from the man by the wagon. "I'll take all 6, the voice stated, calm and without inflection. "Name your price." "For the lot." A shocked silence fell over the square. All eyes turned to the tall figure. Elias Thorne's head snapped up, a mixture of surprise and greed flickering across his face. The auctioneer faltered, mallet hovering midair. Alara stared at the man, her mind reeling. All 6? The idea was audacious, impossible. Who was this man? A wave of fresh fear, different but just as potent as the last, washed over her. The unknown felt terrifyingly vast. The man stepped fully into view, his face now clearer under the weak sun. It was weathered, lined, his jaw set firm. His eyes, though shadowed by his hat brim, seemed to hold a quiet, steady intensity. He didn't look like a savior or a villain. He looked like a man who had made a decision and would see it through, regardless of the spectacle. Elias Thorne, recovering his composure, named a sum exorbitant and grasping. The man nodded, a single, sharp motion. Done. He didn't haggle, didn't hesitate. He simply accepted the price for human lives as if it were the price of a herd of cattle. Alara watched, paralyzed by disbelief and a nascent, fragile uncertainty. They were bought. But bought for what purpose? The fear coiled tighter in her gut. The transition from the auction block to the back of a covered wagon was jarring, dreamlike. One moment they were objects of public spectacle and shame. The next they were being gently, almost awkwardly, helped down by the taciturn man and a younger, equally quiet man who seemed to be his companion or hand. Elias Thorne counted the money greedily, signing papers with a flourish, not sparing a single glance back at his daughters as they were led away. It was as if they had ceased to exist for him the moment the transaction was complete. The finality of his abandonment was a cold, hard stone in Alara's heart. The sisters were settled onto straw in the back of the wagon, the canvas cover drawn tight, plunging them into a dim, enclosed space. The younger man drove, his back a silent presence. The tall man, the one who had bought them, rode alongside on horseback, his shape occasionally visible through gaps in the canvas. They rode for hours, the rhythmic creak of the wagon and the muffled sounds of hooves the only soundtrack to their fear and confusion. The sisters huddled together for warmth and comfort, whispering questions Alara had no answers for. Where were they going? Who was this man? What did he want with them? Alara watched the slivers of landscape visible through the canvas tiers, endless plains, scrub brush, a vast, indifferent sky turning shades of bruised purple and orange as dusk fell. The cold deepened. Faye began to cry again, softly this time, a helpless sound that tore at Alara. She held the youngest sister close, stroking her hair, whispering reassurances she didn't feel. They were utterly at the mercy of this stranger. He hadn't spoken more than the necessary words at the auction. His silence now was both unnerving and strangely neutral. He wasn't cruel, not overtly. He hadn't hurt them, hadn't threatened. But he had bought them. The stark reality of that transaction overshadowed any flicker of relief at being removed from their father's grasp. They stopped once to rest the horses and eat. The younger man built a small, quick fire. The tall man dismounted and approached the wagon. He didn't open the back, but spoke through the canvas, his voice low and gravelly. "There's food," he said simply. "Hardtack jerky, water skin. Eat what you need." He didn't wait for a reply, but left the provisions by the wagon wheel. Alara hesitated, then reached out and retrieved the items. The food was plain but sustenance. They ate in silence, the simple act of eating a strange island of normalcy in their bewildering situation. The man, she still didn't know his name, stayed by the fire with the younger man, speaking in low tones she couldn't decipher. They didn't approach the wagon again until it was time to leave. They rode into the night, the darkness absolute save for the distant, unchanging stars. Alara drifted in and out of sleep, her body aching from the bumps and sway of the wagon, her mind a tangled mess of fear and questions. She woke shivering just before dawn, the wagon finally slowing. Peeking through a tear in the canvas, she saw a cluster of low buildings silhouetted against the paling sky, a ranch. It looked isolated, stark, surrounded by vast, empty land. This was their destination. This was his home. A new wave of apprehension washed over her. What awaited them here? As the wagon rolled to a stop, the tall man dismounted and walked towards the house. Two figures emerged from the shadows of the porch, men, silhouetted against the faint lamplight spilling from a window. They were big men, their stances relaxed but alert. The tall man spoke to them, too low for Alara to hear the words, but the tone was calm, steady. He gestured towards the wagon. The two figures turned and looked towards it, their gazes invisible in the pre-dawn gloom. Alara pulled the canvas tighter, her heart pounding. More men. She counted 6 distinct shadows milling around the porch and yard now. 6 men. A chilling possibility began to form in her mind, raw and terrifying. The man had bought 6 daughters, and he had 6 sons. The tall man, whom Alara heard one of the others call Jedediah, opened the back of the wagon. The sudden influx of light was blinding. He stood there, a formidable figure silhouetted against the dawn, looking at the 6 scared girls huddled in the straw. His expression was unreadable. He didn't offer a smile or a kind word, but his hand was extended, not demanding, simply offering a way out of the wagon. "Come on," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Inside. It's cold out here." They disembarked, stiff and hesitant, blinking in the growing light. The 6 figures on the porch watched them, silent, still. They were indeed men, ranging in age perhaps from late teens to early 30s, all sharing a similar ruggedness, their faces serious, unsmiling. Ilara instinctively positioned herself slightly in front of her younger sisters. Jedediah Thorne didn't introduce his sons immediately. He simply gestured towards the house. "You'll be warm inside," he repeated. The house was Spartan, clean, smelling of wood smoke and dried herbs. There was a large, warm kitchen with a crackling fire in the hearth. A woman, older and sturdier than the sisters had ever known, was already up, preparing breakfast. She had a kind face, her eyes weary but not unkind. Jedediah introduced her as Mary, his housekeeper and the boys' surrogate mother since his wife had passed years ago. Mary greeted them with quiet sympathy, offering them chairs by the fire and warm water to wash their faces. The simple acts of warmth and welcome were almost overwhelming after the cold indifference of the past few days. Jedediah and his sons left them to eat the hearty breakfast Mary prepared. Ilara watched them through the kitchen window as they went about their morning chores, saddling horses, mending fences. They moved with an easy competence, speaking little amongst themselves. They were rough men, shaped by the hard land, but their interactions seemed decent. There was none of the leering or cruelty she had feared. The initial, terrifying assumption about his intentions remained unspoken between the sisters, a heavy weight in the air. Later that morning, Jedediah Thorne sat them down at the large kitchen table. His sons remained outside, deliberately giving them space. He spoke plainly, his gaze steady, meeting Ilara's directly. "My name is Jedediah Thorne," he said. "This is my ranch. These are my sons." 6 of them, he paused, letting the quiet implication hang in the air. "I saw your father selling you like chattels." It wasn't right, he wasn't offering pity, but stating a fact, a conviction. He explained his proposition, his voice devoid of sentimentality, focused solely on practicality and survival in a harsh world. He needed women for his household, for his sons. His sons needed wives to build their own families, to secure the future of the ranch. He saw the sisters lost and without protection, and saw a solution that could benefit both parties. "It's a hard life here," he said. "Long days, hard work. But it's an honest life, and you will be safe. You will have a home, a name, a future." He laid out the expectation plainly. They would be married to his sons. Not immediately, he clarified, but after a period of getting to know each other, of seeing if the arrangement could work. There was no pressure, he stated, though the very circumstances of their rescue made the refusal seem impossible. He offered a choice, stark and clear: this life, or the uncertain, perilous fate they would face alone in the world. Ilara listened, her mind grappling with the enormity of his words. Marriage. To strangers. Yet, as she looked at the quiet strength in his face, the steady gaze that held no malice, and remembered the cold calculation in her father's eyes, the offer began to feel less like a new form of ownership and more like a proposal of partnership. A harsh partnership born of necessity, but one that promised safety and a future where none had existed. She looked at her sisters, their young faces reflecting a mixture of fear and a dawning, fragile hope. She was the eldest, their protector. The decision, she knew, rested largely with her. Over the following weeks, life on the Thorne Ranch settled into a rhythm. The sisters, under Mary's patient guidance, learned the routines of the household: cooking, cleaning, laundry, tending a small garden. The Thorne sons, initially distant and awkward, gradually began to interact with them. They were men of few words, their days consumed by the demands of the ranch. But they were unfailingly polite, even gentle in their own rough way. There was no hint of the cruelty or demanding behavior Alara had braced herself for. They were simply men working their land, carrying the quiet weight of their own lives. Jedediah Thorne observed them all, his presence a constant, steady anchor. He didn't force interaction, allowing the relationships to develop organically or not develop as the case may be. He spoke to Alara often, not about the future arrangements but about the land, the weather, the challenges of ranch life. He seemed to be assessing her, seeing if she possessed the strength and resilience required for this life. In turn, Alara watched his sons, learning their names, their quiet habits, their individual temperaments. John, the eldest, steady and serious. Thomas, quieter with a kind smile. William, strong and dependable. James, lean and watchful. Robert, younger with a restless energy. And young Daniel, barely older than Faye, still finding his place. Fear gradually gave way to a tentative sense of security. They were fed, clothed, sheltered. More importantly, they were treated with respect, not as possessions, but as individuals, however uncertain their position. The stark contrast between their father's treatment and the quiet, unlooked-for decency of the Thorne men was a constant, humbling reality. Alara felt a fierce, protective loyalty growing towards her sisters, but also a dawning sense of responsibility towards this new, unconventional household that had taken them in. The community surrounding the ranch was sparse and spread thin. News traveled slowly, but inevitably. Whispers reached the ranch, carried by passing traders or at the infrequent visits to the nearest town. The story of Elias Thorne selling his daughters, and Jedediah Thorne buying them, became a local legend, twisted and speculated upon. Judgment, harsh and swift, followed. There were veiled accusations of impropriety, of a different kind of ownership, of taking advantage. Some religious folk cited scripture, condemning the arrangement as unnatural, immoral. This external judgment coalesced into a tangible threat when a circuit preacher, spurred on by gossip and self-righteous fervor, arrived at the Thorne Ranch with a small delegation from the nearest settlement. They came under the guise of offering spiritual guidance, but their true purpose was clear: to confront Jedediah, to condemn his actions, and perhaps, Alara feared, to try and rescue the sisters, returning them to the precarious fate they had been saved from. Alara felt a surge of the old fear, the vulnerability. But this time it was different. It wasn't just for herself, but for her sisters, and for the fragile haven they had found. As the preacher and his group stood stiffly on the porch, voicing their accusations and demands, Jedediah Thorne met them with his usual quiet, unyielding presence. He didn't raise his voice, didn't lose his temper. He simply stated the facts. He had provided a home and safety for girls abandoned by their father. He intended to see them settled respectably, married to his sons, if both parties agreed. Then, something shifted. Alara, standing just inside the door with her sisters, stepped forward. Her heart hammered, but her voice was clear and steady. "We were sold," she said, addressing the delegation directly, her gaze unwavering. "Discarded. Mr. Thorne gave us refuge. He offered us a future when we had none." Her sisters stepped up beside her, Beatrice and Clara adding quiet but firm words of agreement, Faye clinging to Alara's skirt but meeting the stranger's eyes with surprising defiance. It was a small act of courage, born of desperation and a growing sense of self-worth, but it spoke volumes. The delegation, clearly unprepared for the sisters speaking for themselves, especially with such conviction, faltered. They had expected passive victims, not young women asserting their own agency. Jedediah Thorne watched Alara, a flicker of something akin to approval in his steady gaze. His sons, standing behind him, their faces impassive, nevertheless conveyed a silent, formidable solidarity. The preacher, his arguments losing their steam against the quiet dignity of the scene, eventually retreated, muttering threats of further action that sounded hollow even to his own ears. The threat, for now, had been weathered. In the aftermath of that confrontation, the atmosphere on the ranch shifted subtly. The bonds between the sisters and the Thorne men deepened, forged in the shared defiance of external judgment. The tentative trust solidified into something more substantial. The concept of the marriages, once a source of fear and uncertainty, began to feel less like an obligation and more like a chosen path, a way to build a life together on this hard, beautiful land. The marriages didn't happen all at once, nor were they steeped in romantic pretense. They were practical, necessary unions, solemnized by a traveling magistrate some months later. Elara married John, the eldest son, his hand large and comforting in hers during the simple ceremony. Her sisters married the other sons in turn, pairing off according to quiet affinities that had formed over time, shared tasks, quiet conversations, a simple understanding that grew in the silence. There were no grand pronouncements of love, but there was respect, shared purpose, and a profound, unspoken commitment to building a life together. Elara, once the terrified girl on the auction block, stood tall. She was no longer just a sister, but a wife, a partner in the running of the ranch. She had found not just safety, but a place. Her sisters, too, had found their footing, their individual strengths emerging in the stability of their new lives. They were still the 6 sisters, their bond unbroken, but now they were also daughters-in-law of Jedediah Thorne, wives to his sons, the foundation of a new generation on the land. The path had been harsh, marked by loss and humiliation. They had been treated as property, bought and sold. But from that degradation, an unexpected resilience had blossomed. They had been saved not by a knight in shining armor, but by a pragmatic man of the land who saw a need and met it with practical action, offering not charity, but a chance to build anew. They had traded a life of vulnerability for one of hard work and quiet dignity, finding strength not in submission, but in the fierce protection of the home and the unconventional family they had built from the ground up. The scars of the past remained, a reminder of where they had come from, but the future stretched before them, uncertain but filled with the quiet promise of shared purpose and enduring resilience on the wide, open plains.